Delancey Street in New York's Lower East Side, hardly one of the city's best-known sights. Yet what happened in this street nearly 50 years ago continues to affect all of us today. Wall Street. Most of us know what happened here 50 years ago. Inside the stock exchange, on October 29, 1929, the market collapsed. It came to be known as Black Thursday. The Wall Street crash was followed by the worst depression in American history. That depression has been blamed on the failure of capitalism. It was no such thing, but the myth lives on. What really happened was very different. Although things looked healthy on the surface, business had begun to turn down in mid-1929. The crash intensified the recession. So did continuing bank failures in the South and Midwest. But the recession only became a crisis when these failures spread to New York, and in particular to this building, then the headquarters of the Bank of the United States. The failure of this bank had far-reaching effects, and it need never have happened. It was something of a historical accident that this particular bank played the role it did. Why did it fail? It was a perfectly good bank. Banks that were in far worse financial shape had come under difficulties before it did, and had, through the cooperation of other banks, been saved. The reason why it wasn't saved has to do with its rather special character. First, its name, Bank of United States, a name that made immigrants believe it was an official governmental bank, although in fact it was an ordinary commercial bank. Second, its ownership, Jewish. Both its name and the character of its ownership, which had so much to do with attracting a large number of depositors from the many Jewish businessmen in the city of New York. Both of them also had the effect of alienating other bankers who did not like the special advantage of the name and did not like the character of the ownership. As a result, other banks were all too ready to spread rumors, to help promote an atmosphere in which runs got started on the bank, in which it came into difficulty. And they were less than usually willing to cooperate in the efforts that were made to save it. Only a few blocks away is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It was here that the Bank of the United States could have been saved. Indeed, the Federal Reserve System had been set up 17 years earlier, precisely to prevent the worst consequences of bank failures. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, whose directors today meet in this room, devised a plan in cooperation with the superintendent of banking of the state of New York to save the Bank of the United States. Their plan called for merging the Bank of the United States with several other banks, and also providing a guarantee fund to be subscribed to by still other bankers to assure the depositors that the assets of the Bank of the United States were safe and sound. The Reserve Bank called meeting after meeting to try to put the plan into effect. It was on again, off again. But finally, after an all-night meeting on December 10th, 1930, the other bankers, including in particular John Pierpont Morgan, refused to subscribe to the guarantee fund, and the plan was off. The next day, the Bank of the United States closed its doors, never again to open for business. For its depositors, who saw their savings tied up and their businesses destroyed, the closing was tragic. Yet when the bank was finally liquidated, in the worst years of the Depression, it paid back 92.5 cents on the dollar. Had the other banks cooperated to save it, no one would have lost a penny. For the other New York banks, they thought that closing the Bank of the United States would have purely local effects. They were wrong. Partly because it had so many depositors. Partly because so many of the depositors were small businessmen. Partly because it was the largest bank that had ever been permitted to fail in the United States up to this time. The effects were far-reaching. Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. There were runs, there were failures of banks by the droves, and all the time, the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of their depositors without closing their doors. The way runs on banks can spread and can be stopped is a consequence of the way our banking system works.
That made sense.
You may think that when you take some cash to a bank and deposit it, the bank takes that money and sticks it in a vault somewhere to wait until you need it again to turn it back over to you.
Okay, how would you like this?
Like 2 10s, 1 5, and 5 1s.
Okay.
The bank does no such thing. It immediately takes a large part of what you put in and lends it out to somebody else.
Thanks.
How do you suppose it earns interest to pay its expenses or to pay you something for the use of your money? The result is that if all depositors at all the banks tried all at once to convert their deposits into cash, there wouldn't be anything like enough cash in the banks of the country to meet their demands. In order to prevent such an outcome, in order to cut short a run, it's necessary to have some way either to stop people from asking for it or to have some additional source from which cash can be obtained. That was intended to be the purpose of the Federal Reserve System. It was to provide the additional cash to meet the demands of depositors when a run arose.
A classic example of how this system could and did work properly can be found over 2,000 miles from New York, near the Great Salt Lake in Utah. In the early 30s, some banks in Salt Lake City and surrounding towns began to get into difficulties. The owners of one of them were smart enough to see what had to be done to keep their banks open, and courageous enough to do it. When fearful depositors began to clamor to withdraw all their money, one of George Eccles' jobs was to brief his cashiers on how to handle the run.
Well, then we called all our employees together, and we told them to be at the bank at their place at 8 o'clock, and just to act as if nothing was happening, just have a smile on their face, if they could, and me too. And we had 4 savings windows, and we said, never leave the window. Lunch hour, anything else, we must have every window open all day. But the important thing was, we knew you'd have a big line there, so there's no use trying to hurry because the line was going to continue. So we said, now, when you get a withdrawal slip and the passbook, go back and check the signature, even though you know your friend John Jones, just to delay time, just to mark time. And then when you pay the money out, we're not going to pay in $100 bills. We're going to pay in 5, 10s, and 20s, and count it twice, and hand it out with a smile.
The bank survived the morning, but they didn't have enough cash left. So in the afternoon, they called for more from the Federal Reserve Bank.
So the Federal Reserve sent up the armored car. 2 big sacks full of currency was brought in by the guard, crowded through the crowd. And the assistant manager, Morgan Kraft, came in also. So Mariner, my brother, grabbed Mr. Kraft, and he said, now, get up on this marble counter and tell these people that you've brought up a lot of money and there's more where that came from. And he did. And then Mariner got up and said, now, you've heard that story. We're not going to close. We're going to stay open as long as any of you people want your money. So don't worry about it at all. Well, of course, you had one other bank in the city, and we called him and told him that he couldn't close either. He said, well, I can't. I haven't any money to stay open. So we made him a temporary loan. Because we had another bank closed while this run was going on. The psychology of the public would be such we'd never break the run in our bank. Everybody would come until they got all of their money out.
The bank survived the first day's run. It was time to change psychology. The second day was to be very different.
So that evening we called our employees all together because we knew that the next day people had been working